This week on Worldview, what are the big takeaways from the Blinken visit to Delhi and what does it mean for the Modi-Biden roadmap ahead? Hello and welcome to Worldview at The Hindu with me, Suhasini Haidar.
We've seen over the last couple of decades a relationship that has grown stronger and deeper across multiple administrations in both of our countries. And President Biden's determination is to continue in exactly that direction, to grow it even stronger and even deeper.
Now, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to Delhi was less than 24 hours, but it saw 4 meetings, all of which were talked about. He began the day by meeting civil society representatives, went on to meet National Security Advisor Ajit Doval, then External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, and finally Prime Minister Narendra Modi. In terms of issues, given the large range of engagements between India and the US, there were some that were more in focus, some that weren't mentioned as much. In their public statements and their readouts, there were actually 4 subjects that Blinken and Jaishankar really spoke most about. What are those 4? There was COVID, the fight against coronavirus, the Indo-Pacific strategy and the Quad, Afghanistan, and then democratic freedom. So let's take each one of these subjects one at a time and talk about what they were able to discuss during that meeting. To begin with, India and the US have cooperated on fighting COVID from the start of the pandemic. Remember, Indian HCQ shipments to the US were followed by the US sending ventilators, more recently sending vaccine ingredients to help boost Indian manufacturers. In addition to the previous grants of about $200 million, Mr. Blinken this time announced $25 million more to help with Indian vaccine efforts. What does that mean? That means supply chain logistics, addressing vaccine hesitancy, and helping to train more Indian healthcare workers. But the elephant in the room was really Indian imports of US-made vaccines, which remain stuck because of indemnity issues. What are indemnity issues? Simply put, US manufacturers like Pfizer and Moderna really want India to sign a liability waiver in case of any adverse effects of the vaccine and its use in India. They've pointed out that 50 other countries at least have already signed those waivers. But India has said that it has not given this waiver to any other manufacturer. It cannot make an exception and cannot sign that clause. The issue is still being discussed, but it appears to be at an impasse. Remember, it's 2 months since External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar went to the US to ask for those vaccines, and those vaccines have not yet hit Indian shores, while US grants of vaccines to all of India's neighbors, including Bhutan, have now reached. Now, Blinken said that once regulatory issues are resolved, the vaccines would be moved to India. The second one was Indo-Pacific and Quad cooperation. Remember, this is an area of the fastest growing cooperation between India and the US, bilaterally as well as multilaterally through the Australia, India, Japan, US Quad. This is an area for working together. They've been working together on climate change, on fighting coronavirus, emerging technologies, also upholding the international rule of law, particularly the law of the seas or UNCLOS. This is often an area where China gets very prickly. In fact, when asked about the Chinese objections to the Quad, it calls it a clique, Blinken said, this is not a military alliance. He said it's a grouping of like-minded democracies working on all of these issues. Jaishankar likened the Quad to a grouping like BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And he said that countries, indicating China, need to get over the idea that the Quad is directed against them. Clear convergence on this issue. And that was also seen with the visit of US Special Ops Commander General Richard Clark to India this week. The third issue, and this is the one that took a lot of the headlines because of all the developments going on there, was Afghanistan. Jaishankar said that on this issue there are more convergences than divergences, but that indicated that there are some differences, and we'll speak about that. Government officials have called the India-US position on Afghanistan really the big takeaway of the Blinken visit because of his statement that the Taliban will not be recognized if it takes Kabul by force, and that there is no military solution to the conflict. Now, the truth is that while that position is something that India agrees with, the deep divergences remain one of concern when it comes to the US position on Afghanistan. What are those concerns? One, the rapid pace of pullout, which is clearly emboldening the Taliban and will do so much more after August 31st, when the last of the US troops pull out. Then there is the US's engagement, continued engagement of the Taliban, despite its refusal to call for a ceasefire, to stop its attacks targeting civilians, including an Indian journalist who was killed, and to continue the power-sharing arrangement talks with the Taliban despite all of this. There is then the US engagement of Pakistan, clearly a deep concern. Blinken, while he was here, called Pakistan's role a vital role to play in using its influence with the Taliban. And then finally, the US decision really to cut India out of its connectivity plans in the region. The US actually chose this month to announce an Afghanistan, Pakistan, Uzbekistan US Quad. It was called a new Quad for connectivity. The US aid has already paid for and conducted trials for truck trade convoys that go from Tashkent in Uzbekistan to Karachi, also from Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan to Karachi. And even in the meeting between the US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and the Pakistani NSA Moeed Yusuf, there was a lot of talk about this regional connectivity plan. The fourth issue between Mr. Blinken and Mr. Jaishankar when they met was on human rights and democratic issues. This is always the tricky time for US-India relations, as India is very wary of the lecturing on these issues that the US, especially Democrat administrations, tend to do. Mr. Blinken was no exception. He began with that meeting I told you about it, the civil society representatives. He spoke about the great challenges before democracies, albeit adding with quote-unquote humility that the US too faces these challenges. He said that to that group that included a constitutional lawyer and faith leaders representing Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist and Baha'i communities in India. Significantly, he chose a Tibetan Buddhist representing the Dalai Lama at the Tibet Cultural Center in Delhi in that group, and not an Indian Buddhist, which was a message meant for China. The message for India, however, was clear. The Biden administration is clear that it will take the allegations of human rights violations, crackdowns on the media, all the issues in Jammu and Kashmir, treatment of NGOs, dissent generally, all very seriously, including anti-conversion laws and farmers' protests. All of this was discussed during that meeting. Now, unlike Beijing, which protested the meeting and very sharp tones and said that meeting the Tibetan representatives in Delhi, Mr. Blinken was actually interfering in China's internal matters, but New Delhi and the MEA did not react to that meeting. However, in a three-point response that he gave during the press conference, Mr. Jaishankar was very specific about what he sees as India's counterposition. He said three things. One was that democracy is a challenge for both US and India, so you can't have different standards, both must be under scrutiny. The second point he made was that his defense of Modi government's policies and laws that they have passed was that they're an attempt to right historical wrongs. This is not the first time the External Affairs Minister has said this. He speaks about all of these laws that have been passed in the last few years as burdens of history that have to be corrected. He also said freedoms are important and valuable, but cannot be equated with lawlessness or a lack of governance. Another slightly controversial position, but basically something he had said at the G7 meeting as well, that you cannot have a law and order issue that comes out of freedom and not tackle it. You can read more of the exchanges between both of these leaders, the foreign ministers of India and the US, on the MEA's website, mea.gov.in. Now, two major issues were also not mentioned in those public comments, but they remain very important to the India-US equation. The first is, of course, trade. This is obviously dealt with at a different level. It's dealt with between Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal and now the new US Trade Representative Catherine Tai. But it continues to be an important bilateral issue given the high volume of trade between the two countries. On July 21st, the US State Department actually released an investment climate report on India, and called India a challenging environment to work in. Despite several investor-friendly laws being passed, incentives for trade given out, it said that India continues protectionism, an increase in tariffs, non-tariff barriers like phytosanitary standards, etc. And you can see that report on the state.gov website. Remember, India has been demanding that the US restore its GSP status for exporters that the Trump administration had rescinded in 2019. And both sides continue to try and forge even a mini trade deal, but it's been unsuccessful despite the meetings between the Trump administration and the Modi government on several occasions to try and work out the trade issues. The second issue between them that didn't get so much mention was defense. And of course, defense cooperation is ongoing and has increased significantly in the last few years, whether it's the purchase of hardware or the signing of defense agreements, foundational agreements as they're called, or the increase in defense exchanges, military exchanges. Now, the US is hopeful India will buy more US hardware like fighter aircraft and defense platforms. And of course, India is hoping that the US will not react too strongly later this year when it takes delivery, as it is expected to, of the Russian S-400 missile defense systems. They are expected to trigger sanctions, and Mr. Blinken said he could not give a definite answer on how that will be received. Remember, this meeting was really, the most important part of this meeting was for Mr. Blinken to prepare the way for several meetings that are coming up. And many of them will happen later this year. For example, the 2+2 defense and foreign ministers meeting that is expected. The trade ministers, as I said, are expected to meet. There's a Quad ministerial in person of the foreign ministers of the Quad countries, followed by a Quad summit with Prime Minister Modi, Morrison, Suga, and US President Biden. All of them in person, expected to meet in Washington. And finally, leading up to a Modi-Biden bilateral summit that could happen around that time, or it could happen as the UNGA at the end of September is expected to be held, albeit with the COVID situation, and Prime Minister Modi is expected to address that. Remember, New Delhi is still awaiting the new US ambassador to India. There's a charge d'affaires at present. Eric Garcetti is going through his confirmation hearings and is expected to India possibly later this year. So clearly a lot expected in the relationship. We'll track that for you. What can help you track it is also some of the books we would like to recommend. One of them is my colleague Varghese George at The Hindu, who wrote Open Embrace, India-US Ties in a Divided World. This is an update of his previous book that actually talked about the India-US relationship in the Trump era. The second is India Turns East, International Engagement and US-China Rivalry by Frederick Greer. There's A Matter of Trust, India-US Relations from Truman to Trump by Meenakshi Ahmed, and Forged in Crisis by Rudra Chaudhary. Both of those books really look at the relationship from 1947 to the present. And for a more irreverential look, there is Staggering Forward, Narendra Modi and India's Global Ambition. That's a book by Bharat Karnad. We certainly hope you enjoy reading those, but that's all we have time for here on Worldview. From the team here, thanks for watching.